Cody, you with me? It quit. So you got it. All the screen, all the slides is completely on somebody else, not my responsibility. I'm out of that right now. Just letting you know. It worked great. We tested it, and I just turned it on, and it says unable to connect, and I shut it down twice. So punting, fourth and 30, I'm punting. Hey guys, I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ, and I struggle with rejection and addiction, and my name is Keith. Thank you. Got two friends in the audience. I love it. It's really important when I introduce myself like that. We're getting ready to kick off Celebrate Recovery on March 31st at our central campus. And that would be how I would introduce myself. And the reason why I would say that I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ who struggles with is because my identity is connected to Jesus Christ. And that's a differentiation. I know it's a subtle nuance, but it's important, especially to us. When I think about years ago, I was in secular recovery. In secular recovery, I would identify myself as an alcoholic or an addict, and that would be my identity. And that's what I carried, and I felt like I was always working from that place, as opposed to now I'm a believer in Jesus Christ who struggles with. So if you're not familiar with Celebrate Recovery, and I'm going to get a shameless plug in here. Sorry, Colton, I got to do this. It is a 12-step program that started. When you think about 12-step programs, it's the same as the secular programs that you would be familiar with, AA and NA. And it started back in 1935. So a lot of times when people hear recovery, they think of something that's not connected to Jesus. And the reality is in 1935, when they started secular recovery, they started it out of a very conservative Christian group called the Oxford Group. And them and another group of people got together. They wrote the 12 steps, which are all out of what we would know as the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, as well as the book of James. And so Celebrate Recovery has started in Christian organizations. There's probably almost 40,000 churches that have Celebrate Recovery in it now around the world. And it's what we would call a safe place to go get recovery. When I say safe place, I think about anonymity and confidentiality as being kind of paramount to keeping that a safe place. If you come to Celebrate Recovery, hopefully you would be able to maintain your anonymity and confidentiality. I also always like to let people know that Celebrate Recovery isn't just for people who have addictions. So a lot of times when you think of recovery, you think, oh, that's those addicts. That's those people. Like, they're different than me. The reality is, just by show of hands, if you've sinned in the last year, just once, just raise your hand, okay? What about the last week? We're going to get personal now. Okay, great. You all qualify for Celebrate Recovery, right? Hurts, habits, and hang-ups is what we do in Celebrate Recovery. So if you've got hurts, habits, and hang-ups, you qualify. And so would like to invite you to come. I always describe it as a rigorous discipleship or gritty discipleship program as we go through the 12 steps. So I've actually got a group of about 25, 30 people right now that are meeting every Friday night. They're getting equipped, getting trained, and they're going through some gritty discipleship of a step study right now. So today we are in week 4, right? It was week 3 last week. It's week 4 this week for you guys. Week 4 of a series that's called Life's Healing Choices. It was a series that Rick Warren preached almost 30 years ago, and utilized the book that came out of that was Life's Healing Choices. I think we had that available for sale, may still have it available for sale now. It matches up with what you're going to hear today as well. And today's message is about repairing relationships or forgiveness. And you might just kind of inverse that and say, or wrecking relationships, unforgiveness, right? Because if you're not working in this area of forgiveness, really, there's relationship carnage that's going on all over the place. And I would say this message is the message that would probably stop you from growing and becoming a better person. It doesn't matter if you're an unbeliever, like you've never come into a believing relationship with Jesus, and you're like, I'm not even exploring, I'm only here because somebody made me come. That's okay. Or you might be in a place where you're saying, man, I'm kind of curious about Jesus. I've heard some things, and I may be interested in taking a next step. This message works for you as well. Very important. Or maybe you're a brand new believer, or you've been a believer for a lot of years, like sages like Chris Tatham and myself. I mean, we've been believers for a long time. And so it doesn't matter where you are in your journey in life, this is something that every one of us has to step into. As a counselor for over 30 years, I had learned that social pain is inevitable. And social pain is really the stuff that goes on here. It's relational pain. It's what happens in relationships. And it's inevitable. Nobody gets a pass on it. My biggest wound in life has been rejection. And you'll hear that a little bit more as we go on in the message, which is social pain. Rejection is a form of social pain. And for me, would trigger the next thing, which would be depression. Social pain is really the root of all our compulsive and sinful behavior, which we would say is insanity. It's doing the same thing and expecting a different result. And of course, the only antidote for social pain is forgiveness. It's forgiveness. So can we all agree in here today that forgiveness is a great idea until you have to practice it? Right? Like when I think through forgiveness, I was like, no, they have not paid for their sin yet. I cannot forgive them. Or they haven't jumped through all the hoops. Like when they do X, Y, and Z, then I'll forgive them. Or, oh no, what they did was so bad, there is no forgiveness for them, right? And we got all these things that we play in our mind. So forgiveness is a great idea until we have to practice it. So in this step in recovery, I'm supposed to make a list of all of those people who have harmed me or hurt me in my life, and then I'm supposed to get to the place where I'm supposed to forgive them. So before we start, I just want everybody to think through who or what event in your life, just one thing. Don't have to write it down because they may be sitting next to you. So who or what event in your life has caused pain in your life? That social pain that we're talking about. Just think about one thing, maybe two things, because I'm going to hopefully walk you through that a little bit by the time we get done. This is odd. It feels like it creeps up in front of my eye and then I can't see you. Is that normal? Sorry. Now I think I just connected the two pieces, so now I'm going to even be worse. Will it hold on with one ear? Where did it go? Right here? We'll go with this. The red button. So, thinking about who or what. So when it comes to biblical forgiveness, most of us would have lists of people to forgive that would probably look more like a book, right? Lots and lots of people. And let me tell you, again, the list part was easy for me. It was the forgiving part that was hard. Back in September of 2005, I went through an intensive counseling. So been quite a while ago, or almost 18 years ago. And my list included my mother, who gave me away to complete strangers for adoption, both of my grandfathers, who had died by the time I was 8 years old, and one of them took his life, my best friend, who had died from a brain tumor in the 6th grade, a move to the other side of town that at the same time I had been sexually abused when we had just moved. Then I shared that in confidence with somebody who I thought I could trust, actually in the library at school. And by the time we got to the library line, he had shared that with the entire class. A girlfriend who was unfaithful to me multiple times while I was in the Army. And then 2 miscarriages early on in my marriage. And then vocationally, as a pastor, some church hurt. So that's just a few of the things, right? I'm not going to give you my book, but those are some of the highlights that I've experienced. Each of those people or events, if you will, stole my ability to trust, to feel, and somehow they owed me a debt. They had taken something from me. So hurt and broken, what I would do is I would punish them. I would punish them with anger. I would punish them with isolation, icing them out, revenge, resentment. And the reality is, forgiveness isn't something that any of us can take lightly. It truly is God's prescription for the broken. It releases in our bodies natural opioids, which we all know to be endorphins. So I was talking to somebody, I think it was Mark Little, who said he's been running. He ran 9 miles yesterday. You get what's called a runner's high when you do that. It doesn't feel so great in the moment when you're doing it, but man, when you get done, you're like, man, I'm glad I did that. I felt good. I was talking to somebody who was walking laps in the gym, right? That's the reality, right? You get done, and you're like, man, I'm glad I did that. It's the endorphin that's released, and it's naturally released when we forgive. God wired us that way. So today's topic can stress relationships or even destroy your life, and it's the inability to accept and offer forgiveness. In Celebrate Recovery, it's connected to Principle 6, which says, evaluate all my relationships and offer forgiveness to those who have hurt me. And it's connected to Matthew chapter 5, verse 7, which simply says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to talk to you about how to give and how to receive forgiveness. It's the only way that we can get completely free from resentments, anger, fear, shame, and guilt. So I have 3 questions that I want to ask all of us, and I would say that none of us gets a pass to these questions, right? So if you're sitting here again, I don't know where you are in your faith journey, nobody gets a pass. We don't get to say, well, he's talking to them. He's not talking to me. He's talking to you. I'm talking to every single person in here. So here's the first one. And I believe they're sequential. I believe that you almost have to answer these questions in order. And the first one is, have you received God's forgiveness? Have you received God's forgiveness? So we're going to go through these. You can check these off, right? You know what you got to do, where you got to land. And I love this story in Matthew chapter 18. And that's where we're going to spend some time, because this story really is Jesus having a conversation with Peter, one of his disciples. Most of you, if you've read the scriptures at all, you know Peter was kind of that guy. It was just like a bull in a china cabinet, right? He was always asking the out-of-place questions. He's the guy who cut a soldier's ear off at the Garden of Gethsemane. I mean, he was a little bit out there, right? A little bit on the risque side, if you will. And so he's having this conversation with Jesus, and he said, man, Jesus, how many times do I got to forgive somebody? How often do I have to do that? And Jesus said to him, Peter said, 7 times? Like, in his mind, that was God's number, right? That's perfection. If I forgive somebody 7 times, check the box, I'm done. Number 8, I ain't forgiven, I get a pass. That's it, I'm done. Anything 8 and beyond. And Jesus says this, I don't say to you 7 times, but 77 times. Or some scriptures say 70 times 7. And the reality is that, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but how many of you have watched Toy Story? I asked for a show of hands. Good, you guys are good. This is a good, you can use movie illustrations here. They get it. Do you remember the guy who, in Toy Story, Buzz Lightyear, who would always say, what was his chant? To infinity and beyond, right? That's how many times 70 times 7 is. It has no end. It's the idea that you start forgiving today and you don't quit. You just keep going and keep going and keep going. You never stop forgiving. You take that thing of forgiveness serious. The next verse there says, therefore, that the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle his accounts and his servants with his servants. And when he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. So get this picture. You got this king who had the great idea one day that he was going to go to all of the people who owed him money, and he was going to get that debt settled up. And so he started taking account one at a time. He started with this guy over here, and he said, hey, and you owe me 10,000 talents. Now, to get an idea how much that is, and there's a lot of commentary about that is, I don't think anybody's ever settled on what 10,000 talents is. But I'll tell you this, it was a lot. So if you could take Palestine at that time in Jesus' day, there were about 500,000 to 600,000 people in that city of Palestine. 1 year's salary for one person would have been a piece of that. 10,000 talents would have been a 1 year's salary for every single person in that population. So 500,000 to 600,000 years' salaries. Do you get the idea? Probably not going to be paid off in his lifetime. It's a lot. More than a year's revenue for everybody in the city of Palestine. No chance paying that debt off. None. I don't even know how you get to that kind of debt. Like, he must have been a gambler or something. Like, I thought, man, if I had Mahomes money, man, if I had $500 million over 10 years, like, how would I spend that kind of money? This guy was way past that kind of debt. And so he goes to him, next verse there, and he says, out of pity for him, the master of that our servant released him and forgave him his debt. In other words, this guy came to him with humility, and basically what he said is, hey, look, man, I don't know how I'm going to pay this debt off, but I'll work for you the rest of my life. My family will work for you. Like, I'm going to do whatever I can to settle this debt. And the king looked at him, and he said, look, you're forgiven. Debt canceled. I zeroed that out. You don't owe anything. By Jesus' death on the cross, he basically did the same exact thing for you and I. If you can imagine all the sin that you have done, right? The actions, the outward actions that you have done, God forgave that through the person of Jesus Christ. Not just the actions, but also everything you've ever thought. In fact, let's go one step farther, because that account only comes up till today, right now, right? He also forgave everything you're ever going to do, and again, everything you ever thought. And the only thing you and I have to do for that is in humility come to him and say, Father, forgive me, for I've sinned. Stop and turn the other direction. That's what repentance is. And God did that for us. He forgave more than you and I could ever pay. The reality is the penalty for sin is what? Death. It's death. And that's what Jesus did. He came to settle that debt for you and I. No matter how severe we have injured others or ourselves, the grace of God is always sufficient. I love this verse in Romans chapter 3, verses 22 and 23, and this version to me just brings it out. It says, God puts right through their faith in Jesus Christ. God does this in all who believe in Jesus, because there is no difference at all. Everyone has sinned. It was good to see this morning. You guys all agreed. There was 100% participation that everybody in here has sinned, right? No matter. And yet God, it's the idea that through sin, chaos ensues. It ensues in our community, it ensues in our lives. That's that social pain, right? And what God does is God comes along. If you can imagine chaos, God brings order to that. He puts right. He aligns and makes it right. The truth is, if we sin one time, we'd need forgiveness. And I can't move to the next step until I've truly received what God did for me. I say, you know what? What God did for me is sufficient. And it's important, because otherwise we'll hold the next one over our head. So the next step is this. Not only have you received God's forgiveness, but have you forgiven yourself? And that's the idea that what I have done is so big that it's unforgivable. Sometimes we hold debt over our head. So I told you that I lost a friend when I was in the 6th grade. What I didn't tell you is how he got added to my list. Wasn't just the fact that he had died, but I held unforgiveness over my own head. So we had been out snowmobiling in South Dakota. I don't know if you guys have seen enough snow to do that. My brother-in-law let me know about a month ago that they had 9 foot of snow, and it has continued to snow there, just ongoing. So snowmobiles are amazing. I mean, you're on the ground at ground level, 70 miles an hour, 2 RUP 440s, and we're having a blast. We are snowmobiling hard all day long, and about 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, he starts to say, hey, man, I can't do this anymore. And I'm like, why? Like, who would stop having that much fun, right? And he said, I got a headache. Like, my head hurts so bad, I can't do this anymore. And I didn't have a box for that. And so I began to bully him, call him a sissy, and everything I could to keep him going because it struck my nerve. Remember, I struggle with rejection, right? Social pain is he doesn't love me, he doesn't value me, and really had nothing to do with me. They took him to an emergency room in Rapid City, South Dakota, life-flighted him to Denver, Colorado, and the next day they found that he had a golf ball-sized tumor in his head, a malignant tumor, and took that out. When they took that out, he went straight into a coma. The next 4 months, he was in a coma. So the only conversations I had with him were him hooked up to life support in a coma. And the last words he heard from me were not words of encouragement. And I held that over my head. I could not forgive myself, which is kind of, in a way, foolish, because what I was saying in that was that what God did wasn't good enough for me. I needed to punish me. I needed to hold that over my head. Does that make sense? And so sometimes we can receive God's forgiveness, but then I hold debt over my own head. Luke chapter 15, verses 18 through 19 says, I will go to my Father and I will say, I am no longer worthy. And the story there is the story of the prodigal son who had gone away. He had taken his father's inheritance, went to a far country. And this is the lie that Satan tells not just me in that scenario, but all of us. When we do wrong, we believe that what we have done is so bad, I can no longer be worthy even to be called son. Like that God wouldn't call me son. In fact, the lie even gets bigger because now the lie says, if I just work hard enough, if I can just prove how awesome I am somehow, that God will forgive me, and then I can forgive myself. We feverishly try to work our way back into favor with God, carrying that whole idea that if I'm good enough, that my debt will eventually be canceled. I want to remind you the next verse there that back in our passage of Matthew 18 says, and since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold. The reality is he couldn't pay. You and I can't pay. No amount of money or good deeds on our part can cancel a debt, a social debt. But the reality is many of us are unable to forgive ourselves because we want to hold on to the guilt and the shame of our sin. Somehow, when we do that, it gives us control. Right? We think we're still in control when we're able to do that. We punish ourselves instead of canceling the debt. I love these verses in Isaiah chapter 1. He says, come, let's talk this over, says the Lord. No matter how deep the stain of your sins, I can take it out and make you as clean as freshly fallen snow. Even if you are stained as red as crimson, I can make you white as wool. God can take the darkest sin that we have and forgive it. Almost, I'll say this, how dare we not forgive ourselves? We not cancel that own debt. If God can forgive us, how can you withhold forgiveness from yourself? In fact, I believe that we must forgive ourselves before we can honestly even move on to the next step. Like I said, these are sequential. Receive God's forgiveness, forgive myself, and the next step is, have we forgiven those who have hurt us? Have we forgiven those who have hurt us? And there's two reasons we need to do that. One, as we've already talked about, because God's forgiven us. Matthew 5:7 says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. In other words, there's a connection there too. If I'm going to receive mercy, I have to be merciful, right? Those two are connected together. It doesn't say that they had earned or deserved mercy. And if God's forgiven me, I should forgive other people. Colossians 3 says it this way, bearing with one another, and has a complaint against another, forgiving each other, as the Lord hath forgiven you. So you also must forgive. The truth is, I will never have to forgive anybody more than God has already forgiven me. That's important. Log that in your brain if you forget everything else today. I'll never have to forgive anybody more than God has already forgiven me. The reality is, I may have hurt my brother multiple times, and he may have good reason to not forgive me. But the reality is, that's very small in comparison to all the things that I've done, all the things that we've done. I think of tug of war as a great example. In the military, and Chris, you'll appreciate this. This is part of our PT, our physical training. We got to do tug of war, and of course, we like that. It was better than running in battery formation for miles and miles and calling cadence. It was better to go out and play dodgeball and tug of war. But the reality is, tug of war is a lot like unforgiveness and forgiveness. We pick up a rope, and we hold on, and we dig in, right? And the more we pull, the more we have to dig in, and the more we hang on tightly. And the reality is that rope keeps us tethered to the offender, right? To the other side, the person who has hurt us. Just like when the rope is dropped, what happens? The game is over. And the reality is, forgiveness is somewhat like that. When we drop the rope, now we're able to enter into forgiveness with that person. Offering forgiveness ends that pain cycle. As long as I'm holding unforgiveness over somebody, I'm going to continue to re-enter into that pain cycle and feel that social pain. Sometimes the truth is we even put God on the other side of that rope. I know it seems strange, like, why would I have to forgive God? Has God done something wrong? Isn't God perfect? Isn't he a just and good God? I'll give you a little illustration. When my best friend died, I was also mad at God. You see, I had prayed to God. I had begged God that he would come back. I'd begged God that one day when I would go, that he wouldn't be in a coma. I would sit there while he was in a coma and pray and ask him to wake up. I mean, I did everything I could. I had no control. And I was angry at God because he had allowed it to happen. Can I tell you that God didn't cause it to happen and he wasn't to blame? The reality is we all have a day of death before we even arrived on this earth. And it wasn't God's plan. Nobody has a box for dealing with death because God didn't wire us to deal with death. He wired us for life. When he created all the way back in the garden, he created Adam and Eve to live forever. It was because of sin that we all get to experience death, not just physically, but spiritually. We all know that God can't sin, that he's good, that he's perfect, and so it's impossible for him to do wrong, and if you will, even need our forgiveness. But the truth is, we can still hold debt over God's head. I think I shared with you too that my wife and I had 2 miscarriages. And there was a period of time there back when we had first gotten married that I even held that over God's head. And so it's the idea that I don't hold debt over his head as well as others. While we may not need to forgive God, we do need to drop the rope with God, just like with other people, because he didn't cause it. Other people's free will cause it at times. Once you understand free will, you understand that your anger towards God has been misplaced. See, free will is this. He loved us so much that he gave each of us free will. We have a choice to decide between right and wrong every day. Therefore, we need to believe that harm others did to us was from their free will. It was their choice. It wasn't God's, and it certainly wasn't God's will. And so I would say to you, if you've been the victim of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, I hurt with you. I've experienced that. You've heard that in my story. And the reality is, you won't find peace and you won't find freedom until you're able to release those offenders and cancel that debt. Remember, forgiving them in no way excuses it. Right? I think sometimes we have the idea that once I forgive them, that means they're going to get away scot-free. They're not going to be punished. The reality is, that's where we get healing. The second reason is because resentment doesn't work. Not only did God give us a model of forgiveness, but resentment doesn't work. Going back to our scripture, this verse here says, but when that same servant went out, so the guy who had just been forgiven 10,000 talents, right? 500,000 years salary, a lot of money, right? He went out, he thought, you know what? That's a great idea. I'm going to find all the people who owe me money, and I'm going to settle those accounts. That's a great idea. And he finds somebody who owes him 100 denarii. And the scripture says, in seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, pay me what you owe him. In other words, how many watch UFC? It's probably a confession. We'll go get some wings later. This guy, full on UFC choked this guy out for 100 denarii. 100 denarii is about 100 days' salary. So he just got forgiven 1.25 million times what this guy owed him, and he's choking him out. Resentment doesn't work. It's not the way God set things up for us. It's been said that it's like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick and die. It doesn't work. It's foolish. It's unreasonable. This guy was forgiven multiple lifetimes of debt and was holding 100 days debt over somebody else. It says, and in anger, his master delivered him to the jailers. Many interpret that word jailers as tormentors, till he should pay all his debts. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. So what happened was, the guy who had forgiven this guy 10,000 talents heard what he did. He went out and choked somebody out for 100 days. And he was like, yo, bro. I don't know if that's what he said. That's biblical. I think that's the Hebrew or Greek. Yo, bro, I just forgave you lifetimes of debt. And you're choking this guy out for 100 days of debt. I don't have a box for that, man. So here's the deal. I'm going to put you in jail. I'm going to turn you over to the tormentors. And you know what unforgiveness does? Talk about social pain. We are the one who are tormented day and night because we replay that scenario over and over and over. We hold that debt over their head, waiting for them to somehow settle that debt, somehow for us to get even. And the reality is, they're sitting over there. They're already scot-free, if you will. The only one who's being punished is you. Dr. S.I. McMillan wrote a book that showed the two greatest causes of physical problems in your life are guilt and resentment. Guilt and resentment. He said, it's not so much what you eat, it's what eats you that matters. Unforgiveness causes physical health problems, causes emotional health problems. And the reality is, you hold the keys. You and I hold the keys to whether or not we're going to forgive. Think of that former girlfriend or boyfriend or spouse or teacher who embarrassed you in school, or even a parent who never told you that they loved you. That person maybe that you were dating that dropped you and gave you no reason. Unforgiveness literally drains your body of energy. You need to forgive those that hurt you for your own sake. Now, if you've tuned out, you haven't been paying attention, you've kind of drifted off into a warm, comfortable, I'm taking a nap. Wake up, okay? Because now the most important part of this message is going to happen. I didn't pass out, but somebody passed out a bookmark to you guys, right? If you didn't get it, you can get it on the way out. This bookmark, in case you fall asleep again between now and the end, is all the things that you need to know are right there. So we've talked about forgiveness and why we need to forgive. And sequentially, we got to let God forgive us, and we got to forgive ourselves, and we got to forgive others. But here's how you do that. Here's kind of some steps to forgiveness. 1, reveal the hurt. Reveal the hurt. In other words, you're going to identify the offender, the event, the offense, whatever that is. You're going to write it down. Don't do it now, but you're going to write it down. Find some place and get intentional about this. Admit it. Let it out. Face it. Be honest. You actually can't get over pain that's been inflicted on you and hurt that's been inflicted on you until you address it. You have to write it down, have to work through it. It's difficult to forgive a person when it's not clearly stated. I don't know why, but for some reason, we don't want to admit the times that people we love have hurt us. Because we have this misunderstanding that somehow, if I forgive them, I can't be angry at them. The reality is, we need to forgive. You can't forgive what you don't want to own up to. Truth is, people have injured you. We've all experienced hurt. We've all experienced pain. Don't minimize it. There's no level. Hurt is hurt, right? Just like sin is sin. Think about that teacher that's embarrassed you, or that parent who said, you're never going to amount to anything. You're a failure. You're a disappointment. You're not what I expected. That former relationship that was unfaithful to you. That coworker who talked behind your back and caused you to miss that promotion. Write it down. What was the injury? What was the pain? So that's the first thing. Number 2, release them. Release them. You cancel the debt. And I'm going to talk about how to do that here in just a second. But you release them. You let them go. You stop holding that debt over their head, or over your head, or over God's head. So how do you do that? You do it by giving them something they don't deserve. Forgiveness. They're not going to be able to work that off, okay? They can't settle that debt. They can't go back and get that back. It's the only way that you can release them. Realize that forgiveness is a gift that you choose to give. It's not a feeling. Because God has forgiven you, you have a model, and now you can forgive. You don't wait for them to ask for forgiveness. Sometimes we hold it over their head and we're like, well, when they ask me for forgiveness, then I'll forgive them, but not until then. They haven't asked me, or they haven't suffered long enough. You don't wait for them to ask. And the next question is, how often do I do it? So I'm going to write them down. I'm going to forgive them. How often should I do that, right? That was Peter's question. How many times? 70 times 7, or until infinity and beyond, right? It's not optional, because those feelings are going to keep on coming back. And every time you get those feelings, you've got to forgive again and again and again. Even after you've forgiven. By the way, forgiving somebody doesn't mean that you've forgotten it. Doesn't mean forgotten. Sometimes we get this, again, false idea that, well, I've forgiven them. Maybe I haven't forgiven them because I keep thinking about it, or I've thought about it again. It's remembering it forgiven. Like, I've forgiven them, and now I'm remembering that I forgave them. An effective way to do that is to visualize them being in an empty chair. You get 2 chairs. You sit in one, you put them in the other chair. They're not actually there. You visualize them being there. And you pull out your list, and you say, hey, Dad, I just want to sit you down because there are some things that you have done that have hurt me, and I want to share that. And so you begin to go through that. You get that chair. Imagine that they're there. Share how they've hurt you. And then you say, and I've forgiven you. I've forgiven you. Because God has forgiven me, and I've learned that resentment is just crazy. It doesn't work. I'm going to let that go. Another way to do it is very similar. You write it down on a letter. So if you don't want to do the empty chair, if that's too much for you, write it down on a letter. Write a letter. Don't mail it. Don't mail it, right? Same thing. How'd you hurt me? Start today. I'm going to forgive you because God forgave me, and resentment doesn't work. Write it down in a letter. The third thing you do is you accept the offender unconditionally. Accept them unconditionally. Matthew 18:27 says, and out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. So how do you know when you have fully released the offender, that person who has hurt you? is when you can think about them and you truly want the best. You truly want the best for them. You remember the debt is canceled. You remember that it's forgiven. You can pray God's best for their life. You can pray blessing in their life. Now, that's hard. That's hard. You begin to look at understanding their hurt and understanding that hurt people hurt others, right? It's what we do. When we feel hurt, we want them to hurt. So now, when you've forgiven them, you don't go, like, let's say their car breaks down, you don't go, yep, they deserve that. I'm glad their car broke down. You say, man, I'm going to pray for them. I'm going to pray that car will work again. I'm going to pray that they can find an easy solution to that. It's hard. Anybody want to do that? It's tough. That's when you know that you've released them. You're able to keep on forgiving them until you can finally think of them and it doesn't hurt anymore. How do you forget a divorce, or how the hurt experience from your parents, how do you forgive that, or physical or sexual, emotional abuse, or trauma in your life? How do you forget that? You can't. You can't forget it, but you can remember it forgiven. So, doesn't that seem unfair that we would forgive somebody, that we would let them off scot-free? Remember, God is just. God is good. He's the judge. He'll take care of it. It's not our role. The fact is that relationships can tear you into little bitty pieces, but God can glue those pieces back together and cover it with His peace over your pieces. The bottom of your bookmark talks about to love is to risk. And so what I would say is, I dare you to practice forgiveness. I dare you. So another way that you can forgive is you can make your list, and at the end, you can burn it. It's gone. As far as the east is from the west, that's how far God removes our sin, never to be remembered again. Practice forgiveness. Thanks for letting me share.